Bonjour, bon après-midi, good afternoon. I'm Daniel Bellam, the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, and I'm glad to see all this wonderful crowd gathering today for this econ lecture for the winter semester. Although we are already in spring, as you can see outside, it's quite a wonderful day, so thank you for taking the time to come here. And by this beautiful afternoon, I would like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land that has long served as gathering and exchange site among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage you to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada is known as MISC, M-I-S-C, and is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, our undergraduate academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as today's presentation, today's econ lecture, on really a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. And I think the topic that we'll discuss today is very contemporary and very, very important. You can learn more about our work and our forthcoming events at mcgill.ca/MISC, M-I-S-C. It is my great pleasure again to welcome you to this econ lecture for the winter semester. And I would like to thank the econ family, including Gail Econ is here with us today, for their support because the econ fellowships and the econ lectures that are attached to them really enrich the life, the intellectual life of McGill and also of the broader community. The Econ Visiting Fellowship in Canadian Studies was established by the Econ family in memory of William R. Econ. The fellowships are awarded each term to active scholars whose research or teaching advances Canadian studies. MISC is very grateful, of course, to, as I said, to the Econ family for the opportunities that are afforded by these fellowships. And so today, of course, I'm really excited to introduce you to our visiting Econ fellow at MISC for the term, Monsieur Raphaël Melançon. And Raphaël has more than 15 years of experience in the fields of media, public relations, as well as in federal, provincial, and municipal politics. So I see quite a few students here. If you're ever interested in playing a role in politics as an advisor or otherwise at any level of government, we have a practitioner here who's still quite young practitioner. He has some gray hair, but he's actually... Oh, you're here? I was looking for you. I said, okay, you're following me. Yes, I have to hurry up then. Yes, hello, Raphaël. Yes. Raphaël holds a bachelor's degree in communications and political science from Université de Montréal. He began his professional career working for major Quebec media, first with TC Transcontinental, then with TVA Network, where he held a variety of positions as a journalist editor, then as a managing editor in the Montreal newsroom. After completing an MBA at HEC Montréal, Raphaël became a communications advisor to the Federal Minister of Infrastructure, Communities, and Intergovernmental Affairs, and Minister of the Economic Development Agency of Canada for the regions of Quebec. And then after that, after 3 years, with a large public relation firm, he returned to politics in 2018, this time on the provincial side as Director of Communications for Ministerial Office in Quebec City. Drawing on his extensive experience, he founded in 2020 his own public affairs consultancy firm, Trafalgar Strategy, strategies or strategy. Yes, exactly, as we wish, depending on the language you prefer. He also regularly comments and analyzes political news in Quebec and Canadian media in both French and English. He was recognized as a public relations professional by the Société québécoise des professionnels en relations publiques du Québec in 2021 and received an award of excellence from the SQPRP for his work in 2022. Bienvenue Raphaël, merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Et aujourd'hui, vous allez discuter un sujet très important, Social and Digital Media, Polarizing Public Opinion in Canada. Merci encore.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this lecture in such a large number. It's very nice to see such a crowded room today with you all here. Both here on campus, by the way, and for those of you who are also joining us online today. I truly appreciate your interest in this important topic, which I'm sure affects and worries all of us in Canada, as it poses in the end a direct threat to our democracy in the long term. First of all, I'd like to thank McGill University and the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, its director, Professor Daniel Belland, as well as the entire wonderful team at MISC for offering me this incredible opportunity as your Winter 2024 Eakin Fellow. Not forget the slides. I would also like to take a moment for special thanks to the Eakin family for their generous support in making this incredible experience and this event today possible for all of us. I'm sure Mr. Eakin would be proud to see that his legacy continues thanks to the invaluable contribution of his descendants. Is it the right photo?
That's my grandfather.
Oh, is it? It's very difficult to find photos of Mr. Eakin, but anyway. Okay, there you go. So this is one of the William R. Eakin. This is not the right one, though, but okay, next one in line. Does he look like his father? Okay, so still look alike. Anyway, so before we begin, I wish to mention that I am not your typical visiting scholar, as it is usually the case with Eakin Fellows. I'm actually, as Daniel mentioned, a practicing professional. Thus, the Eakin Fellowship has allowed me to become a visiting professor here at McGill University for the winter 2024 semester, and I am deeply grateful for this unique, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's a dream come true for me, to be honest. Speaking of my work as a visiting professor, I see here today in this room many of my wonderful students from my class in political communication. Thank you all for being here today and for making this teaching experience one that I certainly will remember for the rest of my life. Over the past 15 years, whether as a journalist, a political staffer in Ottawa and Quebec City, a candidate for city councillor in Montreal in 2017, a PR professional, or a political analyst in Canadian media, I've had the honor and privilege of being an active observer of our country's political landscape. Throughout these years, I've seen the rapid emergence and growth of social and digital media and how it has, in various ways, directly impacted Quebec and Canada's political sphere. Thus, this lecture will include some of my personal observations on how social and digital media have contributed over the past 2 decades to polarize public opinion in our country. Until recently, many people used to believe that Canada was protected against radical ideologies and movements. Some thought that the way our political system functions prevented far-right or far-left parties from gaining widespread support, and that our democratic institutions were strong and protected against any attempts from marginalized extremist groups or movements to destabilize them. This, unfortunately, has all changed in recent years. In my point of view, an important breaking point in our recent history was reached during the COVID-19 pandemic in the midst of the debate around mandatory vaccination and confinement. In this extremely tense debate, opposing science to misinformation, if not disinformation sometimes, we've seen events like we had never seen before in this country and which we thought were only possible south of the border. The so-called Freedom Convoy that we see here on the screen, those protests were particularly eye-opening when it comes to realizing how effectively social media can actively contribute to push people, whether to the left or to the right, towards extremism, if not sometimes hatred, harassment, and violence, even blocking Parliament Hill in our country's capital. These events have sparked, for me at least, the beginning of an interest in this topic. To be honest with you, I'm more than ever worried about how social media and digital media already affect the health of our democracy, but also how it can weaken it even more if nothing is done to prevent further radicalization of public opinion in the future. This is why I chose this issue as the subject of my Econ lecture, to raise awareness towards the risks that the internet poses to democratic institutions in liberal democracies like Canada, and to try and identify solutions we can implement in order to prevent it from further harming and dividing our society. But before we dig deeper into the causes that have led to this situation, let's begin with some definitions. What is polarization and what causes it? Well, as you probably know already, humans are social creatures. Group affiliation is essential to our sense of self. So we naturally need to identify to a group which we feel related to. When it comes to politics, multiple behavioral consequences flow from partisanship. As Teufel and Turner wrote, when we identify with a political party or ideology, we instinctively divide up the world into an in-group, our own party, and an out-group, the opposing party. DiMaggio, Evans, and Bryson define polarization as both a state and a process. As a state, it refers to the extent to which opinions on an issue are opposed in relation to some theoretical maximum. As a process, they describe polarization as the increase of such opposition over time. DiMaggio, Evans, and Bryson also state, amongst other things, that the more dispersed public opinion becomes, the more difficult it will be for a political system to establish and maintain centrist political consensus, and that the greater extent to which opinions move towards separate modes, as we see here on both sides of the political spectrum, the more likely it is that social conflict will ensue. It is important here to distinguish two types of polarization. The first one is ideological, which means it focuses on differences between policy positions of various groups, while the other one is affective, meaning that it leads to an emotional dislike and distrust of political outgroups of the others. It becomes us versus the other side, and it is a danger for social stability. Affective polarization can lead to increased hostility and a lack of willingness to compromise or work together with people who hold different political views. This phenomenon can be seen in both online and offline settings and has been on the rise in several countries in recent years, not just in Canada. So polarization, in other words, or in other words, public opinion shifting towards the extremes of the political spectrum, it's something we should take very seriously, as it can become a threat to our country's social unity and peace in the long term. Some of you don't know what that is. Being born in the 1980s, I am of the very last generation that remembers a world without the internet. Yes, dear students, I'm that old. I remember when I was a kid in the 1990s, how this novelty promised so many exciting opportunities for the future. Access to information and knowledge would be greatly facilitated, and people would be able to access higher education for free and from anywhere on the globe. In a world where, until then, people relied mainly on mass media such as newspapers, the radio, and cable TV to get to know what was happening around us and abroad, we were hopeful and optimistic that the internet would bring a new era where information, facts, news, and events could be shared almost instantly. But in our somewhat naive way of seeing it, we forgot to think that some could also use the internet to mislead and manipulate people. As it has historically been the case with any new media, some people have tried and sometimes succeeded at using them to their advantage by propagating lies to the masses. A good example of this, of course, are the Nazis, whom in the 1920s and the 1930s especially, have used novelties of the time, such as cinema, to support their evil, anti-Semite, and fascist propaganda campaigns, leading to their eventual rise to power. With propagandists such as Joseph Goebbels and movie director Leni Riefenstahl, whom you see here on the screen, Hitler's regime has perfected and mastered the technological tools of its time, using common fears and emotions to manipulate the minds of the German people until the Nazi Party's downfall in 1945. A certain parallel can be drawn here with social and digital media. These new technologies of the 21st century being currently poorly regulated, due in part to the fact that they have no frontier, and thus it makes it highly difficult to enforce local legislation on a worldwide phenomenon, the internet has over time somehow become the far west of information. The lack of checks and balances on major platforms such as Facebook or Elon Musk's X, formerly known as Twitter, as we know, has made it more and more difficult for ordinary people to differentiate the truth from fake news. Because in this digital world where you can hear or read one thing and its opposite at the same time, truth is no longer about facts. It's about what people perceive and commonly accept as being true. That's why we see so much division in our world these days. This is particularly true in the US, where depending on the state you live and the sources you get your news from, people almost no longer live in the same reality. But let's not forget that even though we'd like to think we're so much better on this side of the border, Canada is not that different from our American neighbors, and that we are as much at risk as them of seeing social fractures appear in our country as they are. The rise of artificial intelligence and deepfakes is also another factor to consider in the future, as we are just seeing the beginning of how these new technologies can impact our daily lives. If AI can make Joe Biden sing a popular song, how will we know if it's true or not when the President of the United States announces the Third World War? Believe me, my friends, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So, how did we get there? The World Wide Web, as its name suggests, has created a vast international network dedicated to sharing information amongst individuals, governments, and organizations. Although a very good idea on paper, that also means that today anyone can become their own form of media and propagate information, whether true or false, in real time. This is a major change compared to the situation the world was experiencing for centuries until a few decades ago. Before that, sharing information to the masses required important means which were complex and costly and consequently not accessible to all. At the time, the media, economic and political elite controlled the ways people could access information and thus the information the masses received itself. That's why journalists have for a long time been considered as the fourth estate, alongside the executive, legislative, and judiciary branches of power. Their control over information and the editorial treatment they applied to it had a direct impact on how citizens saw the world around them. This gave them enormous power over our society. This is something my students have seen a lot in our class. I see smiles and faces here. But it also ensured that information was going through what we call the traditional media filter, which you see here on the indirect form of communication, whereas you have the direct form where the information goes directly to the population without going through that media filter. So that traditional media filter determines which news and events will be shared with the masses, how they will be presented, and how much importance will be given to each news piece. This helped prevent fake news from being widespread, as professional journalists have the duty and are usually expected to verify and fact-check everything they broadcast or print in their papers. This traditional media filter can no longer be applied in a world where anyone can become a media and where information is shared instantly without any mechanism to ensure its veracity. Conspiracy theorists, for instance, are not a new phenomenon at all. People who are reluctant to trust our public institutions have actually always existed. The only difference is that before the rise of the internet, they were mostly marginalized people acting either alone or in small, disorganized groups, isolated from the rest of society. They didn't have a platform. Today, social and digital media have given these people a platform, a safe space where they can not only share their beliefs with others, but also reinforce and feed their own biased perception of reality, and most of all, convince and recruit new members or followers and mobilize themselves into much larger and structured movements, such as QAnon, for example, which we have seen, the impacts of which we have seen on January 6th on Capitol Hill in Washington. In a recent classified intelligence report that was partially leaked in Canadian media no later than this month, the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, which brings together experts from the RCMP, CSIS, the Communications Security Establishment, and Global Affairs Canada, identify anti-authority narratives as an imminent threat to the fabric of Canadian society, adding that violent threats have become more and more common even outside of elections in our country. The report warns that threats against politicians have become increasingly normalized due to extremist narratives prompted by personal grievances and fueled by misinformation or deliberate lies. There are actually three main types of what we could qualify as fake news. The first and most obvious one, of course, is disinformation, which are false reports that are intended to mislead people. They're basically lies, pure and simple. The second one is misinformation, which is reporting that proves to be false but was not initially intended to be. And last but not least, malinformation, where the information and reporting are true, but are presented in a way that is designed to harm specific people or groups, such as leaking sensitive information on the eve of an election to harm the opposing party, for example. All of them have one thing in common. They all contribute to manipulate voters' beliefs and behaviors in order to bring them to support radical or extreme ideas and movements which they would normally not support without the use of fake news. Apart from what's happening online, the impacts of public opinion polarization in Canada are numerous and highly tangible. Here are some recent examples. First, there's the rising support towards parties which could be considered as extremists in terms of the values and policies they defend, such as Maxime Bernier's People's Party of Canada, first picture, and on the provincial stage, Éric Duhaim's Quebec Conservative Party, which is in certain aspects ideologically closer to the PPC than to its federal conservative counterpart. Let's just compare the performance of Bernier's PPC between 2019 and 2021, the two federal general elections. In 2019, before the pandemic, the PPC only got 1.6% of the total votes from coast to coast. 2 years later, in the middle of the COVID-19 international crisis, Bernier used and leveraged fake news, as well as many Canadian voters' fear of vaccines, to bolster support to his party, tripling his results with 4.9% of the total vote. Not enough to get a seat in the House of Commons, thank God would say some, but still a significant increase for a third party that's fairly new in Canada's political landscape. A similar phenomenon could be observed on the provincial side with Duhaim's Quebec Conservative Party. You can see Duhaim on the second photo here on the screen, which, tabling on the anger of part of the population regarding vaccine mandates and confinement in Quebec, received 9 times more votes in the 2022 general election than in 2018, going from a mere 1.46% to 12.91% in just 4 years, a record high for the party that was founded in 2009. Of course, one could not talk about far-right parties without mentioning the election of Pierre Poilievre as the new leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, which marked a major shift in the party's position and political approach. Of course, here I'm not going to link the Conservative Party of Canada to the far right, but still, we have to acknowledge that while he was running for the CPC's leadership in the midst of the pandemic, Poilievre did not refrain from speaking openly against vaccine mandates and publicly supporting the Freedom Convoy protesters, seeking the support of the most radical elements of his party in order to win the leadership race in 2022, which ended up with a landslide victory for him. And you can see Poilievre here walking outside with protesters during the pandemic. I myself vividly remember a partisan event that I attended during the CPC's leadership race in Montreal. As a former political staffer under Stephen Harper's government in Ottawa, I was curious to see Poilievre in action while he was on tour across Canada. His campaign team had gathered thousands of Conservative members in a packed convention center in the West Island here in Montreal. I recall that when we got there, I was surprised to see so many trucks with Confederate flags in the parking lot. It was a pretty good sign of the reasons that brought such a large crowd inside that hotel that day. Once inside, I could not believe what I saw and heard. Whenever Poilievre mentioned vaccines or confinement, people in the audience were yelling things such as, "We're not in China!" that way. It's just an anecdote, of course, but to me, it showed an important ideological shift for that party, which I no longer recognized compared to the Conservative Party I had worked for just a few years prior to that event. Comparing vaccines to dictatorships? Really? What Poilievre did in order to win his party's leadership simply legitimized and reinforced the ideas of those who perceived Canada as being at the brink of fascism simply because the Trudeau government was trying to save as many lives as possible at a time when the fear of COVID-19 had paralyzed the entire world. Because let's face it, parties and partisanship also contribute to polarizing and radicalizing public opinion. Canadian leaders such as Poilievre, Bernier, and Duhem, just like Donald Trump in the US, do certainly take part in dividing citizens through the use of wedge issues, harsh language, and even sometimes insulting or degrading their opponents in order to make political gains. It certainly pays off when it comes to party fundraising and winning elections, but their words are also picked up and reused by their followers on social media. So the effect goes both ways here. Parties and politicians can further polarize the public discourse on social media and vice versa. Another impact of public opinion polarization in our country is the increased number of incidents related to harassment and intimidation of elected officials, based on their beliefs or party affiliation. In fact, in Quebec only, nearly 1 in 10 municipal elected officials has resigned since the last municipal general election in Quebec in the fall of 2021, so 2.5 years ago. That's nearly 800 people dropping the ball, abandoning the ship, in part because they could no longer fulfill their duties due to harassment and intimidation, both in person and online, which puts an overwhelming burden on their mental health and that of their families. Compared to just 4 years ago, that's a whopping 41% increase in the number of municipal elected officials resigning before the end of their term. And we're just over midterm right now, remember. And the impact of this situation is not just about human beings being psychologically crushed by their opponents and intimidators. This also puts an enormous toll on the finances of Quebec municipalities, which have to organize by-elections whenever someone resigns. The last major resignation to this date is that of Gatineau Mayor France Bellil, which you see on the first photo here, whom was elected for the first time in 2021. During a very emotional press conference in February, Bellil announced she's resigning because of the, quote, toxic climate in municipal politics, further increased and fueled by opposition parties at City Hall and aggressive opponents on social media. Following her call for change, the provincial government announced a $2 million investment to offer municipal elected officials psychological support and services. Imagine when you have to offer psychological support to people because their work environment has become so toxic for them to continue serving their community, that means we have a serious problem here. This issue is particularly true in smaller communities. In fact, 61% of those who have resigned over the past 2 years were elected in towns and villages with a population of less than 1,000 people. Considering these municipalities represent only 42% of the province's total population, we can come to the conclusion that harassment and intimidation of public officials is even more of a problem in smaller communities than in large cities. And that's just on the municipal level. Just 2 weeks ago, Parti Québécois leader Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon unveiled that he and his family had received serious death threats online. The case is currently under investigation, and the man has been arrested by police forces. And he's far from being the only one in this situation. On the federal stage, for instance, we've recently seen unfortunate events where elected officials, such as Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, were personally targeted by angry and aggressive people. On a side note, having worked in Ottawa not long after the tragic shootings on Parliament Hill in 2014, I can't believe that the federal government still today does not provide personal security detail to its ministers, as does the Quebec government since the deadly 1984 attack at the National Assembly. Are we waiting for someone to die to finally act on this? Especially considering the current political tensions exacerbated by social media these days, it is, in my point of view, more important than ever to provide our top elected officials with the proper protection they need according to the important public offices they hold. Harassment and hatred on social media doesn't solely affect politicians or parties. More recently, for instance, we've seen a significant increase in cases of hatred towards certain religious groups and cultural communities in Canada following the events of October 7 in Israel and the military operation in Gaza, both online and also targeting public and religious institutions. According to a global news investigation citing police figures, anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim acts have jumped in every single Canadian city, major Canadian city. In Toronto, for instance, attacks on the Jewish community and its institutions more than doubled to 132 compared to the previous year, while those against the larger Muslim population nearly tripled from 12 to 35 in a single year. On November 9, 2023, bullets were shot on this school here in Montreal, a Jewish school. The same thing happened again only 3 days later. Thank God, students were not in class at the time and there were no injuries. But the sense of terror and fear remains strong within the targeted communities. There is no doubt in my mind that these acts of hatred have been fueled and encouraged by the immensely tense climate on social media regarding the current crisis in the Middle East. So now that we've seen the impacts of this situation, how can we prevent social and digital media from further polarizing and radicalizing public opinion? Well, first and foremost, the solution relies on improving education. I can't say it more. Education, education, education. Civic education, of course, so that citizens better understand how our democratic institutions function, and by doing so, improving people's trust towards their government. But also, education by helping voters develop a more critical approach when it comes to the news they consume. If we show people how to question the information they receive and to verify their sources, we will help reduce the effect of fake news shared on the internet on the beliefs and behaviors of the population. This way, we will prevent people from falling into the trap of those who want to manipulate the most vulnerable of our society, whom are often also the least educated of our society. The second solution is to better regulate what can be said or done on the internet. As much as I'm in favor of free speech, we have to acknowledge that hate and insults have nothing to do with free speech and that lies are not opinions. They're just intended at hiding facts and viciously misleading others. But regarding regulating an international phenomenon that has no frontier is far from being an easy task, of course. Canadian laws, for instance, can hardly be enforced in companies and organizations based in foreign countries. Considering that, it is clear that a coordinated international effort will be required to ensure that the same rules apply everywhere when it comes to regulating the internet and social media. Finally, the professionalization, sorry, it's a long word for francophone. The professionalization of journalism will be essential so that people can know which reporter or which news outlets they can trust to get reliable information. At the moment in Canada, anyone can pretend to be a journalist. This, in my humble point of view, is a major issue. We wouldn't let, and also as a former journalist, we wouldn't let a fake physician, lawyer, accountant, or psychologist do that, knowing the major consequences it could have on those who trust them. That's exactly why we have professional orders, to prevent con artists from pretending to be someone or something they are not in reality. To this day, members of the press have no obligation whatsoever regarding what they write or say in media. Adhesion to the Fédération professionnelle des journalistes du Québec or to the Conseil de presse du Québec, for instance, is not mandatory, and no license is required for journalists to work and cover events in Quebec. That, to me, is a problem. Should so-called journalists from partisan media, such as the far-right Rebel News or the Falun Gong-controlled Epoch Times, be allowed to cover government press conferences, or should they rather be considered as activist organizations and treated like so? To this day, the rules are not clear. In Quebec, there are 46 professional orders in total. If we have an order for social workers, for geologists, for dietitians, and for acupuncturists, why wouldn't we have one for journalists? Considering the substantial power they have on the future of our society and the fact that they are the so-called fourth estate. If other countries have done it before, why wouldn't we do it too? This, of course, is nothing against the freedom of press. As a former journalist, I'm a huge partisan of freedom of press, but also of the independence of the press. It's all about protecting the population's right to have access to verified, credible, and reliable information. In this era of fake news, we must implement mechanisms that will allow for the enforcement of a code of ethics on professional journalists and regulate who can or cannot be part of the profession with regards to their academic background, of course, but also to their past actions. If you propagate fake news, you're out. It would also help rebuild voters' trust towards traditional media, which has dropped considerably in recent years, hitting a historic low of 42% in 2022 in Canada, according to a Reuters Institute study. That being said, I've talked a lot about the negative aspects of social media. But social and digital media's impact on public opinion in Canada is far from being only negative. In fact, new technologies have allowed multiple positive grassroots movements to emerge and thrive in the past 2 decades here. We can think, for instance, of the Idle No More movement, for example, which gained national exposure and widespread support thanks to an efficient use of social media that acted as a powerful tool for the recruitment and mobilization of thousands of supporters across the country in about 10, 12 years ago, in 2012, 2013. Idle No More sparked a vast movement of affirmation of their rights by Indigenous communities and has contributed to raising awareness towards the sometimes harsh reality of First Nations, as well as Métis and Inuit peoples in Canada. Although there is a lot of work to be done 12 years later, Still a lot of work. And I've worked a lot with Indigenous communities in Canada, especially in the far north of Quebec, and I can tell you there's still a lot of work to be done. It has had a significant impact on the empowerment of Indigenous peoples and the establishment and structuring of organizations dedicated to the defense of Indigenous rights in Canada, which have since continued the fight for recognition and reconciliation. We're already reaching the end. In conclusion, we have explored today how social and digital media can threaten and destabilize our public institutions and democracy if nothing is done to better contain the effects of fake news on the polarization of public opinion in this country. As Canadians are more divided than ever before, and extremist movements on both ends of the political spectrum grow in support, we must act today to make sure that voters and citizens have all the tools they need to prevent further radicalization of the public discourse and opinions. In order to do so, we will need to better educate the general public regarding the dangers of fake news and how to prevent falling into those traps. Implementing regulations both in Canada and working with our international allies so that we better control what can be said or done on the internet and can act when lies are spread publicly on these platforms, without affecting freedom of speech. And finally, to prevent fake journalists from manipulating and radicalizing public opinion. The future of our democracy and the national cohesion are at stake here, friends. Yes, the internet can still be a promising tool to elevate societies, plural, because not just in Canada, as we believed it would become in the 1990s originally. But if we want it to have a positive impact on people, we will first and foremost have to put an end to the ongoing chaos due in part to the blind spots and the lack of checks and balances of our current system that some malicious individuals and groups exploit to push their evil political agenda on us. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Raphaël. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's time